Great. Welcome. Nice that you're here. I welcome all of you here in Silent Green and all of you at home, watching at home. Welcome to the second of 3 events in the discussion series, Nature is Not Natural, AIDS, Collectivity, Radioactivity. This is Derek Jarman here. And that I played Think Pink from Funny Face, Stanley Donen, I believe, the director, with Kay Thompson singing the song that Derek Jarman uses in The Garden. I'm Marc Siegel, and I've had the pleasure of organizing these 3 events in the context of this fantastic exhibition project inspired by, dedicated to, and departing from Derek Jarman's film, The Garden. And again, I thank Bettina Ellekamp, Jörg Heitmann, Stephanie Schulte-Strathaus for this opportunity, as well as Merlin David for the excellent support and organization. And she will be our microphone passing person today. And she was at the bar before. And also Bennett, Jonas, and Jonas for this technical setup. Thank you so much for making this possible. The series critically returns to the local context of Derek Jarman's work and his film, The Garden. This very humble series, it's just 3 events, so we can't do everything. But we attempt to go to critically look at the context of Derek Jarman's work and his film, The Garden, in order to mine their relevance for a contemporary global situation. The discussions take us from AIDS to COVID, from a threatening nuclear power plant hovering over queer performances taking place in and around a beautiful, sparse garden, to the environmental catastrophe that is a dangerous horizon of our present. And from the collectivity around AIDS activism, to the collaboration and collectivity in art and activism today. We kicked off the series with Heather Davis's great talk on plastic and queer kinship, and I'm extremely happy to have a bunch of wonderful people with me today to consider gardening, collectivity, and activism. And we'll begin the evening with a screening of 2 works by Rehana Zaman, and I will introduce Rehana in just a second, but I'd like to welcome all of our guests today. Rehana Zaman here, Bhaskar Sarkar, Bishnupriya Ghosh, and Ed Web-Ingall. Welcome to you all. You can clap. Okay. They're clapping. I don't know if you can hear that, but they are clapping. Okay, and the way that I organized it today is I thought we would start with these 2 films by Rehana. And after that, there will be a discussion. I'll have a Q&A with Rehana, and you're welcome to join in the discussion. And then we will move into presentations, short presentations, 10 to 12, 15-minute by Bhaskar Sarkar, Bishnupriya Ghosh, and then we'll finish with a slightly longer presentation by Ed Web-Ingall, who brought us some surprise footage that he's uncovered in his research into AIDS activists video in the UK. Rehana Zaman is an artist from Heckmonwijk. I don't know if I pronounced it correctly. Okay. But she's based in London, and her work speaks to the entanglement of personal experience and social life, where moments of intimacy are framed against cultural orthodoxies and state coercion. Conversation and cooperative methods sit at the heart of her practice. Her work moves between the art and the film world and will be featured in forthcoming exhibitions this year, including an exhibition in Toronto at Trinity Square Video, at the Borås International Sculpture Biennial in Sweden, the Artist Film International in Whitechapel in London, among others. In 2019, she co-edited the artist publication Tongues and was shortlisted for the Film London Jarman Award. She's currently a board member of Not Nowhere Artist Workers Cooperative and Lux Moving Image, who also distribute her films. And I thank Matt Carter and the people at Lux for making her work available to us today. I was interested in showing Rehana's work in this context, in part, I have to admit, because she was a nominee for the Jarman Award. That intrigued me. What is this Jarman Award? I think that's something we can discuss maybe afterwards. But also because I think her interest in gardening and collaboration can provide a useful starting point for considering Jarman and the garden from a multiple of perspectives today. And on top of it, she herself is a gardener. So I think she can add her own expertise about gardening to our discussion. Yeah, welcome, Rehana. Would you like to say a few words about the films today?
Thank you, Marc. Yeah, thank you, everyone. Thank you for inviting me, for being part of this amazing panel with really smart, amazing people. I'm really excited to get into a conversation with everyone. Just a quick thing, really, about the two films. It's quite strange for me to see these two films together because there's quite a long period between them. So I think the first film you're going to see is I, and I, which was made in 2013. And it's quite an early film in sort of my work, really, and came out of a commission by Studio Voltaire, working with a curator called Louise Shelley and Joe Scotland, who were basically working with the archive of the feminist photographer Jo Spence, and curating a show around her work around illness and her collaborative methods working within the community and community photography and collective working. So the commission for that film really arose out of spending time with Jo Spence's archive and thinking about these questions of what working together as a group might be and what the consequences on the individual is within that, and trying to take those questions to a group of people to see what might emerge. So a lot of the methods that have gone into that film have come from a conversation with this archive. So the film is a 20-minute film, and working with a group of young people from Body and Soul charity in London, who have now moved on from the charity, but which is a charity supporting people affected by HIV and AIDS. And then moving forward to the other film that you'll see today, Your Ecstatic Self, which was a film that I actually made in 2019, which just before the pandemic hit, actually. It was sort of finished. January 2020, it started to circulate. And it's a film that uses a slightly, it's much closer, it's much more personal in a way. And I won't say too much about it, but I guess there's a slightly different method of production that's behind it. So yeah, for me, it's quite interesting to see those films together in a program, and I'm really looking forward to chatting with you in a bit, Marc, about it.
Yeah, thank you, Rehana, and thank you for allowing me to crudely put the two of them together in this way. We'll see how that works, and I look forward to discussing it. And I also just wanted to tell all of you here live, unfortunately, I can't help the people who are not here, but the bar is still open throughout the evening, and I'll do my best to do double duty and serve you drinks if you like. Great, so enjoy the screening, and we'll be back to discuss after the two films. Rehana, are you there? Yes, welcome back, Rehana. We're clapping. I don't know if you were able to catch that.
I did. Thank you.
Okay, good. Yeah, Rehana, maybe I'll just, excuse me, I'll just start first by apologizing because between the two films, we didn't see the end credits on I, and it then, I thought it created a kind of interesting connection, if you will, between the two films, because then when the second film begins and we are hearing your brother speaking, it was even though I know the films, it still felt like, are we hearing, is he speaking about himself? Are we continuing in this vein of characters seeming to share a story and a kind of collective storytelling? For me, it was an interesting connection between the two films, was this question of storytelling and attention, and your careful attention to the spoken word. That may sound right now too abstract. I don't know, but I know in a lot of your work, you're very interested in letting people speak and hearing what they have to say. But maybe could you say something about, if we let your ecstatic self sit with ourselves for a second, but to go back to I, and I, can you say something about the origin of this speaking, the origin of this text, how that, where that came about?
Yeah, it was funny. I really had the same feeling. Sorry, I'm doing this weird thing where I'm watching you on the YouTube channel, but there's a lag, so it looks like you're still talking.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I know it's a complicated technical setup for everyone.
So I'll just try and ignore you a little bit.
Yeah, ignore me.
Ignore the movement, but yeah, it's really funny because I had a really similar feeling actually watching them together, and that sort of the seam running through the two films around forms of storytelling and what is being said and what is being inferred through what is being said, the kind of the subtext of a story, or what might be read between a story that kind of belies something else or can become quite cryptic or circular. Or performative, in the case of Sajid sometimes, and certainly in the other film, but in I. So the script actually from I and I was entirely constructed through material generated through these workshops that we were having. So there was a year-long process of workshops that took place on site at Body and Soul, and there was a youth club at the charity that I first volunteered at for a few months, and then began to work with a Thursday night group and held these like periodic longer sort of sessions of a week or several days, and then followed up with evening sessions. And in those workshops, we would play different improvisation games. We would do workshops such as relaxation workshops around the body, somatic exercises to build trust. And so what you see in that first section of the walking around the room and changing your body shape, that comes from the workshops that we were doing and that we would use each time. Some of the stories and the games that were told were generated through the workshops. And so as much as possible, there was a desire to try and channel what had been spoken by members of the group into a form that the film could hold, so that we would. There was the difficulty of the project was we were dealing with the fact that none of the young people were to appear directly in the films and to be recognizable because of their vulnerability, and this was sort of under child protection and safeguarding. So we were immediately dealing with this idea of mediation and translation. That was kind of the first and foremost process through which we were thinking about how we might construct a film together. And each meeting that we would have was kind of responsive. Actually, there wasn't we knew we were making a film, but there was no predetermined outcome as to what that film might be that we might develop a script towards. So the kind of fragmentary nature of the film is also reflective of the way in which we as a group were communicating our experiences and feelings in those spaces, I suppose. So there's certain details that give you a sense as to who the people in the group might be, the names that are used, the details around the grandparent and the background to where people live, and and also it's very much coming from the imagination of a young person. So we have, we have intrigue and a thriller, and the level of drama is quite heightened. So the script, as much as possible, was trying to play with these different registers of speech that were appearing through these different conversations and forms of conversations that we were having, and trying to be true to that, to honor that, and see where that would take us.
I see. And they're actors who are performing these texts, correct? Or
yeah. So we cast the 3 actors, and so part of the script was direct transcripts of stories that might be shared, and then part of the script is a story that we were constructing together through these improvisation games around this motif of the pig. The pig came up in a sort of a comedy improvisation word association game, and so we tried to building on theatre improv games from Brecht, from Augusto Boal and Forum Theatre, really trying to pull from theatrical traditions that were politically invested, that were also about, to some extent, how to speak to political and social concerns and affect change through those modes. We were experimenting with that in the sessions, and so the story runs parallel to the story of our interaction in the workshops, and it becomes very confused.
Yeah, no, that's something, because I felt like the performance of the actors seems to there's definitely a distancing between them and the speech, so that the story seems not to belong to any one of them, but we both get the performers, and then we get this kind of strange story that's being continually expanded upon, reflected upon by the different people. So that's why it interested me what the relationship was between the people speaking and then what was spoken.
Yeah, for sure. I think there was also this desire to play with that gap, to not try and collapse that gap through a smooth. I think that increasingly, and it's something I've been thinking about a lot, is the consumption of the audience, and the desire to, particularly around storytelling, or the sharing of personal experiences, or the sharing of pain or loss or mourning, and how that is presented to an audience. And so I think at that time, actually we didn't speak directly to the reason why we were forming as a group. It never really, the very nature of what the young people were at Body and Soul for, were there for, never actually was never spoken to directly in the workshops. It was always as an escape. It was always as an escape to go somewhere else. And so that's how the material, we kind of trusted the material then just to take us where it would. I think for me, that film is also kind of the beginnings of something about really trying to interrogate what constitutes collective filmmaking, actually. And I think subsequently, I look at that film and I think there's so many things that came out of that I have really tried to deepen and interrogate as a way of working with, and similarly in terms of maybe working with my members of my family, but also trying to think about when if filmmaking is a sort of a form of research on knowledge making, like where am I positioned, and where am I positioned in, what is the context, what is the specificity of my position in relation to the people that I'm in relation with. And I think that, in that film, I think it was, there was so much going on under the surface that also we were having to manage. We were mediated, the group was mediated through the charity, and, that in a way that also affects the possibilities of speech and what can be spoken and what kind of relation can happen. I don't know if that makes sense, but maybe we can.
Yeah. Yeah, if well, actually, I wanted to move then maybe to your ecstatic self, because there seems well, in some sense, with the speech, there seems very little mediation. It's a direct. It seems like a direct discussion between you and your brother in the car, if I follow that correctly, and then you and your sister in the garden. I mean, there's mediation maybe in the aesthetic of the film, in the inserts, this incredible footage from www.hunzo.com. That seems to mediate between, let's say, the garden images and the discussion with your brother. But maybe could we start with come to the garden? Like, I'm not a gardener. I didn't know what these red berries are. But there seemed to be some kind of ritual that was being prepared for with the gardening. And I'd just be interested of why, just simply naive, why bring together this discussion with your brother and you gardening?
So firstly, the conversation is with my brother, and it's kind of never really stated, but I guess it's the degree of intimacy that is taking place in the car suggests a personal relationship. But the person in the green space is not my sister, but she's chosen family rather than biographic bloodline. But I think there was this. So, I mean, there's many reasons why practically it sort of ended up happening that way. Originally, I was actually meant to go to Pakistan to film, actually, and there were issues with like the visa. So originally the outdoor space and the kind of the landscape, the presence of this sort of semi-public space was going to be elsewhere. But that green space is also left ambiguous and is actually an allotment that I've had for a few years. And so gardening and engaging in like growing things and care in a sort of in an environment that isn't an urban environment is something that I've increasingly been drawn to on a personal level, and because I love it. But then increasingly was also thinking about what the specificity of the allotment space is actually as this liminal space, as this space that is between, like an edgeland space between that particular allotment is sort of sandwiched between these industrial estates and green spaces that are kind of might rise up between a fenced area of a railway. And it's actually really beautiful. I rewatched in The Garden. I hadn't seen it for 10 years. And it was just really wonderful to sort of read this film in relation to that, even though it's so different. But thinking about where Derek Jarman's garden is located in relation to the power station and this proximity of nurturing, this act of nurturing and trying to cultivate life under the shadow of something so toxic and overbearing, this sort of gesture of industrial machismo. And in a similar way, I kind of perceive the allotment as being this incredibly potent, I guess, like a portal into these other spaces and these other cosmologies and these other ways of knowing and being in the world. And so for me, this dialogue that's happening in the car, that's so structured actually and direct in this very sort of tight interior space, I was kind of interested in where I could escape that through these other spaces and then where else that might take me in terms of these archival material moments where then it's kind of collapsing these spatial temporal logics that are kind of we carry in our bodies as I was feeling at the time particularly, and in this conversation with my brother around genealogy and around these, I guess the legacies of how like sexuality and gender and race are kind of so imbued with colonial violence, really. and to try and kind of really stretch that, you know, make that elastic and fold it in and not try and create this, I don't know. I think I was also thinking very clearly in the car, that conversation came out of a lot of wanting to kind of speak to the way in which particularly Asian men in the UK, Pakistani Asian men and women actually, but specifically there's a very kind of gruesome way in which Pakistani Asian men are sexualized as sexual predators and, you know, in relation to child grooming and sexual exploitation. And so there's particularly where I'm from, actually, in the North. So there was a kind of a, how can this conversation around an experience of love and desire and sex be placed alongside questions of Islam and religion in a way that doesn't become fractured, but can also move between these binaries of Hindu philosophy and Islamic philosophy in a way that there is actually a scene between Tantra and Sufism, and you know, these things can be mutable or can speak to one another differently. And so, yeah, also, although there's a gender binary appearing, there's also women appearing in a landscape and working the land in a way that we also don't see, you know, that there's an engagement with a practice of cultivation that can be women and non-binary. So, yeah, these were the kind of placements and a desire to see what might happen when those things are placed adjacent.
Great. Yeah, I really appreciate your elaborations. I mean, for me, a lot of that came through in the aesthetic, but that helped provide some background for me. I think I would love to discuss more about the film, but I really would give the audience the opportunity to ask questions. But I think it may be good if we move on right now, if that's okay, Rehana. And Rehana is still with us, so we'll be able to discuss then everything together at the end of this marathon evening. Don't forget to come up and get some refreshments. But thank you, Rehana, for the discussion. And I look forward to continuing this. And now I'd like to, yeah, thank you. I'd like to, oh, people can clap. Was there some clapping? Great. And I'd like to move on now with a contribution by Bhaskar Sarkar, who's here beneath you, actually, in the space. And Bhaskar professionally is a professor for film and media studies at the University of California in Santa Barbara. And he's been working for some time on a project on plastics, what he calls Cosmoplastics, a book project with the subtitle Bollywood's Global Gesture. And also working on a book on queer underground club cultures in millennial Los Angeles. And I should say that that none of these professional qualifications are the reason why I invited Bhaskar Sarkar or Bishnupriya Ghosh, who will speak afterwards, but because actually we both sort of, or we three of us sort of came of age in Los Angeles in the queer club scene together at a time where we were watching Derek Jarman films as they were coming out. And we've all moved on to different areas of interest in our own scholarly life. But I just thought it would be wonderful collectively to reflect back on Jarman through the lens of our present interests. And that's why I'm super happy that Bhaskar Sarkar could join us. So please welcome Bhaskar Sarkar.
Thanks, Mark. So, this call put me down a rabbit hole of the early 90s, really. So when Mark invited me to this panel, I was a bit hesitant at first. Although Jarman remains one of my favorite media artists, I had always savored his work in more personal, more effective ways, and I did not particularly want to subject his epiphanic montages, his libidinal gestures, and his hallucinatory becomings to any form of detached analysis. For my generation, Jarman signifies queer excess and resistance, but Jarman also names an unresolved sense of loss, a generational melancholia. It is difficult to master a critical position with respect to him. So having revisited The Garden from 1990 after a long interval, I was struck by 2 points, and that's what I'll dwell on today. The first has to do with the reaction that a lot of people have when they watch this film, that it is too self-indulgent. I want to explore if this quality, usually taken to be a problem, can be recast in more affirmative terms. The second point is about Jarman's relationship to not just the garden around his cottage in Dungeness, Kent, where he spent his final years, but more crucially, to the act of gardening. The broader question I want to pose here is this: what are the resonances between Jarman's filmmaking and Jarman's gardening? Might self-indulgence provide a link between the two realms of activity? So in his daily extensive diary entries from 1989 and 1990, which were later published as the volume Modern Nature, Jarman writes, responding to somebody's question as to why he always appeared so happy: because I am the most fortunate filmmaker of my generation. I have only ever done what I wanted. Now I just film my life and I am a happy megalomaniac. So a first sense of self-indulgence, often associated with avant-garde filmmakers. They're invested only in realizing their singular vision without consideration for the demands of genre, audience, or financial backers. Just a few days later, on August 31, the tone has darkened and Jarman expresses self-doubt. However hard I try, now I find it almost impossible to connect with others, let alone myself. Was it ever any different? Was I gifted? Or was it as burden of proof that I took to film? Are others happier, more content? I rarely feel moments of self-pity, but when they come, they roll over me. So a second iteration of self-indulgence then, self-doubt, often devolving into self-pity. By mid-1989, Jarman is beginning to experience all kinds of symptoms: allergies and itchy skin, night sweats and fever, acute muscle cramps and weakening vision, all signs of the virus gradually colonizing his body. News arrives from London or New York, it seems every other day, of friends and collaborators losing their battles with the disease. Meanwhile, Jarman's previous film, War Requiem, is being panned by critics and audiences alike. He has just begun work on his next script, which is to be shot without a script. On his next project, which is to be shot without a script. It'll feature his garden at Prospect Cottage in a big way, and Jarman will appear as himself. So from the diary entry of June 24, I cannot watch anything that is not based on its author's life. Acting, camera work, all the paraphernalia bring me little pleasure without the element of autobiography. And from August 16, The Garden is a simple domestic drama, a document, no fiction, the smallest gestures. Here we encounter another twist on cinematic self-indulgence: intimacy, drift, and play as the conditions for creative innovation. An unscripted nonfiction film, intensely personal, mainly autobiographical even, the whole emerging from fevered improvisation, adjustment, and editing, the process itself documenting the self's becoming. There are two aspects to this process: its nonlinearity and its forging of a subject. Early in the film, the voiceover invites us to follow the filmmaker along a different kind of narrative pathway. A standalone half sentence from December 2 penned in the throes of shooting, the filming, not the film. And just a few days later, David asked me how I thought of all this. The truth is, I didn't. You start with one thing and you end with another. So what kind of subject emerges from this cinema of indirection, of perpetual reinscription? If the garden is autobiographical, then the autos of this biography is radically immanent. The film captures the simultaneous becoming unraveling of a German-like subject in the folds of social institution spaces and practices, the church, the monarchy, the school, the bathhouse, the institution of marriage, gay subcultures, paparazzi and celebrity cultures, the otherworldly light on the craggy and windswept shores of Dungeness, the garden in the shadow of the nuclear power plant. And this subject is at once and inseparably individual and collective. The project involves several of the filmmaker's regular collaborators, his creative family, most notably composer Simon Fisher Turner and Jarman's friend and muse Tilda Swinton, as well as Kevin Collins, Jarman's own partner for the last several years of his life, as one of the lead characters. It is a product as much of Jarman's own impending mortality as it is a document of the precarity felt by an entire community ravaged by the AIDS epidemic in the pre-cocktail years. In its lack of a clear structure, its elusive drift, the film enacts a deep sense of melancholia. Jarman would later note that in the garden, all the art failed because AIDS was too vast a subject to film. Failed or not, in retrospect, the film appears to mobilize a remarkably complex semiosis of mourning. Mourning a wasted generation, ignored and abandoned purportedly because it refuses to fit into normative social structures. One might argue that the film's ambitions run deeper, that it places greenhouse effects alongside the epidemic to take on environmental depredation in a resonant, if oblique manner. The garden, the film, cannot be separated from the garden at Prospect Cottage or from Jarman's gardening activities. Planting, arranging, tending, watering, pruning, activities that add up to a regimen of active and sustained care, seem to have provided the ailing filmmaker with a therapeutic vocation, one that offered respite from the frenetic life as a feted cultural figure, and that helped him become more attuned to the demands of his diseased body. The diary entries in Modern Nature are full of joy about the red poppies, of despair. It's a strange feeling to put in the roses and wonder if you'll see them bloom, and of optimism, wondering if the rose outside the kitchen window, now flowering for the first time, will see the nuclear power station out. For Jarman, his body, his garden, and his surrounds all come together in mutuality and empathy. Caring for the garden becomes a matter of self-care. Oddly, Jarman chose a harsh seaside spot close to a nuclear power plant for his final and most significant garden, as if to see if his plants, like his people of his kind, could thrive even under inhospitable conditions. But he goes further, developing his garden in marked distinction from the well-tended English heritage gardens. You see, it is a rather wild garden. I really recommend this. Out with the lawns and in with the stinging nettles and curbside flowers. So this contrary garden is then decorated with local shingles and flint and junk sculpture made out of discarded anchors, corkscrews, parts of metal equipment, and driftwood. The stress is on a certain scruffy nature. It is not the nature of Constable and Palmer paintings, but a modern nature. Jarman invokes his father's strictly utilitarian approach to gardening. He attacks any wayward shrub that hindered the clean straight lines of his mowed lawn, or any tree that dared to grow too luxuriant. and he connects it to the latter's love of discipline and consistency in life. His dad would eat an apple pie every dinner, every evening, 365 days of the year. In contrast, Jarman's gardening, like most of other aspects of his life, is built on the unexpected, the errant, and the queer. It is not practical, but excessive and indulgent. One would expect nothing short of this iconoclastic figure, who was canonized by the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence, a group known for their agitprop use of drag and Christian iconicity, to challenge sexual discrimination and moral policy. I'm reminded here of Bataille's discussion of the restrictive economy and excess that often turns to waste. Order and decorum wrought at the cost of wasted lives, wasted potentialities. But excess returns as expression of vitality, as wily subversion, as spirited resistance. The garden is rather self-indulgent. The etymological root of indulgence, play, to engage oneself, to be or become fixated, connects it to affection, tenderness, complaisance, addiction, yielding, and play. This semantic chain points to the possibility of deep engagement and caring while being exploratory and playful at the same time. As I have suggested, for Jarman, self-indulgence and self-care are intimately linked to the care of his indulgent and excessive community. On February 25, 1998, he writes, "A personal mythology recurs in my writing, much the same way poppy reeds have crept into my films. For me, this archaeology has become obsessive. All received information should make us invert sad. But before I finish, I intend to celebrate our corner of paradise, the part of the garden the Lord forgot to mention." So here, Jarman suggests direct connections between his filmmaking and his gardening. Both activities are driven by an impulse to archive, collect, to document and preserve his memories for posterity, to collect and store away the seeds from his plants for the next season. But simple preservation is not enough. To celebrate our corner of the paradise, the memories, like the seeds, must be revivified, nurtured, and proliferated. The queer life garden must be fully lived out without fear of decay, death, or expiation. This is why the domestic drama of the garden feels so epic, its small gestures so grandiose, so blasphemous, even so revolutionary. On September 13, 1989, as he was beginning to have trouble with his eyesight, and as he was starting to shoot the garden, Jarman wrote the following in his diary, articulating the key function of the film. "As I sweat it out in the early hours, a guilty victim of the scourge, I want to bear witness how happy I am, and will be until the day I die, that I was part of the hated sexual revolution, and that I don't regret a simple step or encounter that I made in that time." Thanks.
Thank you, Bhaskar. That was wonderful. And I think we're attending to a little technical problem with PowerPoint that we should clear up for the next presentation. Bishnupriya Ghosh is not simply a club goer, a classic club goer, but she's also a professor of English and global studies at the University of California in Santa Barbara. And she's completing a book right now, which is, I think, of acute relevance today. It's called The Virus Touch, Theorizing Epidemic Media. And it considers how mediatic processes detect and compose epidemics as crisis events. And she's going to be discussing gardening today, but I think we have, okay, we're up with the PowerPoint. So please welcome, Bishnupriya Ghosh.
Okay, thank you, Marc, for this invitation, again, for sending us back to the 90s. I wanted to actually, what was pleasurable for me was to think about how much of an open futurity there was in Jarman's work. So what I'm really going to talk about is the garden as an emergent milieu and gardening as a kind of environmental practice and theory. So yes, I'm going to start this. Let's see. There'll be just images running. Okay. Is that working? Yeah. So the wild gardens of the Anthropocene. When Hiroshima was destroyed by an atom bomb in 1945, writes Anna Singh, it is said that the first thing to emerge from the blasted landscape was the matsutake mushroom. Following the resilient, abundant mushroom, Singh goes on to explore new assemblies of industrial waste, human foragers, of fungi among human-disturbed forests. And so this invocation of precarious life in a precarious environment launches an exploration that I think was also Jarman's exploration, how to survive in the blasted ruins of the Anthropocene. And by now, of course, this is very familiar to us, multi-species entanglements, environmental disrepair, but it was not so common at the time that he planted these famous gardens around Prospect Cottage at Dungeness in the 90s. He was keenly attuned to precarious life. His wild gardens configured a distributed subject in its encounter with invisible forces. And of course, there's a garden, the physical one that he documents in his Derek Jarman's Garden and his diary, Modern Nature, and its audiovisual counterpart in the 1990 film. And in both cases, deadly pathogens, deadly toxins, emissions burning through cellular life are protagonists. One is already here in his body, the other potentially there, over at the nuclear plant. These are unseen protagonists, and they can be intuited. Avisual matter, they pose a problem of representation. We perceive them mostly in the vital degeneration of humans, plants, and animals. So their presence pervades the environs around Prospect Cottage, from which we can see the glowing Dungeness nuclear power point. So here is, I'm linking between Rehana and Bhaskar's garden to the radioactivity that is coming in Ed's talk. So against devastation and loss, the submicroscopic particles flourish, abundant and unstoppable. The milieu teems with lively presences, indexically caught on camera, in fluctuations of light, the close-ups of objects in motion, and you can see this in some of the footage that I've cut from the film, the varying camera speeds. These cinematic techniques self-consciously underscore the fabrication of the milieu. The garden is not natural. It emerges in natural and technical processes that interpenetrate each other. Towards the close of the film, natural elements, water, fire, wind, are in frenzy, wildly gesturing at the quiet camera. By now, we are quite certain that the torn earth and scorched sky, as Jarman records, no longer offer protection. Living in this place, his wild garden that refuses fences, eschews the calm of the lawn, cluttered with stones and industrial remains, it is both overgrown and sparse, but always changeful. Not his father's garden, as Bhaskar mentioned, the one that is tamed by the axe. It honors his mother's protest of the assault on nature. Now the question is, what do we make of this wild garden in post-Anthropocene thought? Folded in HIV/AIDS collectivities, does Jarman's physical and filmic garden theorize practice what Singh characterized as the living space of entanglements? Is there an incipient politics of entanglement? Even as the gardener makes iterative appearance in film and writing, the garden always exceeds the centered subject. Other becomings are in progress. Faced with imminent death, what does the garden activate? And here you see some of the garden, its overgrowth figures abundance, spilling, leaking, spreading across the landscape. A litany of plants, flowers, herbs, weed proliferate, some native to the landscape, some cultivated from Jarman's exploration of local nurseries. As with the Matsutake forests, we hear that mine craters from World War II at Dungeness are rich in plant life. Industrial waste yields strange delights in new assemblies. More than once, he escapes from the garden. Because it has no fence or boundaries, he asks, where does it end? This topography of a limitless expanse brings some recompense. The dead will become matter, living on in this brutal, seething landscape. Hence, Jarman is especially delighted at plants that leap about, crossing the road. The thrift is out, he writes, a wonderful wild plant that carpets the landscape on the other side of the nuclear station. The overgrowth materializes the wild garden as an extensive planetary living space. I would like anyone who reads my book, says Jarman, to try this wildness in a corner. It will bring you much happiness. Abundance here is technique, a blueprint for living. But in the epidemic episteme, abundance is threat, actual and virtual, extinguishing multicellular life forms. In the pre-retroviral times, in which many of us hung out together, when life was exigent, there was little option but to live with flourishing pathogenic life, to make very difficult kin with awkward creatures, as Eva Giraud names them, which are not charismatic forms of life. And this always complicates the multi-species politics. Overcome by abundance, by biological and chemical particles imperceptible to the naked eye, multicellular life is on the retreat. As a condition against the demos, epidemia forces a reckoning with extreme abundance and extreme loss. There is no middle ground, and we see it now at our current juncture. Against the rugged landscape among bloom and decay, Jarman erects spectral stones, the guardians of loss. He proliferates them among natural forms. Approached from imminent death in this primordial time of mourning, abundance disperses human matter into dust, into the ashes that close the film. This other abundance, the silent spring at Dungeness. The challenge, of course, is to perceive avisual materialities that are breaching body boundaries, are silent killers of the Anthropocene. We know, of course, now, after the infamous conference of 1989, which talked about emerging infectious disease events, that these are ecological events. 60% of our deadly viruses are zoonotic, skipping species barriers. 71% of them are from wildlife. So everything from habitat destruction to industrial farming has created new conditions for viral emergence. Like industrial toxins and radioactive drift, human activity activates zoonotic viruses. Abundant matter, they spread like wildflower, not wildflower, wildfire, our inheritance of planetary damage. But how to render these presences in this garden that sprawls into a greater milieu? How to activate the sensorium, alerting us to their movements? Here, Jarman turns to audiovisual conjurations, disorienting flashing lights, time-lapse photography, of course, on-screen sounds of wind and water, all compose a restless milieu, dynamic and fluctuating in its force. Mediatic gestures speculate viruses, toxins, emissions irradiating in this milieu. We sense movements in the mediums that transport them. And what you're seeing in the images, of course, are these elemental mediums. Elemental mediums sustain the distribution of invisible emissions, quiet, deadly. So it's the wind, it's the fire, it's the water. Vital mediums transmit viruses, so something like blood or mucus. Since viruses don't have any locomotion without bodily fluids, they would not move. Sometimes elemental and vital mediums interface. And if you think of our current circumstance, of course, we are sensing the air between us all the time in the drift of SARS-CoV-2, but the air also enters our lungs, an interior milieu. So nuclear leaks, virus particles drift, as Peter Van Wyk once noted, they're hostile to containment. The medium is the milieu, whispering, moving, blurring, sharpening. Elemental mediums rush at us in the film: fire, water, soil, air. The wind is constant. It rattles the bones in the graves, writes Jarman, sending rats shivering down sewers. The waves crash incessantly against gravelly shores. Blood and water at many junctures exit bodies, eminently transitive. Submicroscopic particles are borne across bodies in this lively, bristling world. Herbs, weeds, flowers, stones, abandoned trash, rabbits and slugs accompany human figures thrown together in irreducible entanglement. This is queer animacy, as Mel Chen describes it, an open spatiality of the body, a wilding of subjectivity. Among these new assemblies, Jarman fords the metabolic rift of industrial times. He ingests the garden. Here, the plant is the botanical mediator between human species and the natural industrial landscape. He often referred to the garden as his pharmacopoeia, brimming with natural remedies. Against the failure of modern science, these ancient secrets were abuzz with potentials. In his writings, Jarman speaks evocatively of rosemary or sea dew as hardy, recalling young men in Greece who wore garlands to stimulate the mind. Where rosemary grew, he writes in Modern Nature, women rule. We hear of friends falling ill, of offering aconite, belladonna, santolina. We hear sleeping with a sprig of lavender under one's pillow enables one to see ghosts, to travel to the land of the dead. Many of my own generation will remember how friends in the pre-cocktail era turned to natural remedies, to astragalus root, to milk thistle, to ward off bodily degeneration from HIV infection. As mediators, plants ensure continuities between molar forms and the larger biosphere. The gardener is an herbalist, tenderly remaking the milieu in a time of emergency. As the wild garden spreads out, as it moves in, the work of repair begins for the body, for friends, for community, for elements, for the earth. Thank you.
Thank you, Bishnu. That was lovely. Yeah, we'll continue. There's so much one could say about these two discussions, but I think it would be nice to bring Ed Web-Ingall into the conversation. Ed is someone who co-edited the Derek Jarman sketchbooks, and he's also active as a filmmaker, a researcher, and a lecturer right now on the BA Film and Screen Studies course at London College of Communication, University of the Arts. He is currently working on a project looking into the role of video in response to housing struggles, as well as on a book called The Story of Video Activism. And I was really thrilled that Ed agreed to come today to discuss his research into AIDS activist video activism in the UK and present us with some of his findings. So please join me in welcoming Ed Web-Ingall.
Yeah, thanks so much. I'm just checking that. I'm going to wait for the slide to be behind you, Mark, and then I think, is it behind you now?
Yeah, it's behind me.
Okay, great, cool.
Yeah.
There's a delay, so I've got it's like Minority Report. I've got loads of windows open trying to follow everything. But yeah, thanks so much. This has been wonderful to be part of this, and seeing that footage in the last presentation was just so beautiful to be reminded of what it looks like down there. I spent a lot of time in Prospect Cottage inside and outside doing research for the book and going through the sketchbook, so it's great to be taken back there. Yeah, so this invitation to speak at this event was a chance for me, like Mark said, to look at some of my current research into AIDS activist video in the UK and then make some connections to my previous work on Derek Jarman. Let's see if this works. Yes. Okay. In his journal, Come Polemic, At Your Own Risk, Jarman reflects on his receiving the results of his AIDS test on the 22nd of December, 1987. The young doctor who told me this morning I was a carrier of the AIDS virus was visibly distressed. I smiled and told her not to worry. I'd never liked Christmas. I put on my dark black overcoat I love so much to walk to the hospital. Wearing it at my father's funeral a few weeks ago, I looked more somber than the undertakers. It gave me confidence for this meeting. 20 years prior to this, Jarman spent some time attending meetings of the Gay Liberation Front. He found their approach, and these are his words, dour, censorious, and joyless, and his attention soon became focused on his burgeoning career, designing sets for Ken Russell's The Devils and shooting Super 8 films of his friends whilst chasing the boys he was cruising at the meetings. Following his diagnosis, Jarman's engagement with what would become queer activism took on a new urgency through his involvement with Outrage, who formed in 1990 as part of a broad-based group of queers committed to radical, non-violent direct action and civil disobedience. Jarman was drawn to their emphasis on queer activism rather than the gay politics he'd previously experienced. For Jarman, queer more fully encompassed his own experiences, and Outrage's anti-assimilationist, angry and creative actions soon meant he became a regular fixture at meetings held in the basement of the London Lesbian and Gay Centre, and he attended many actions. This talk's going to go a bit all over the place, and this map will hopefully keep us in one very loose temporal space. So Jarman wasn't the only theatre designer who became a filmmaker attending these meetings. In 1990, Mark Harriott, who was working for free as a theatre designer at the Young Vic, co-founded a queer video magazine called Pout with his friends, a group of, in his words, poor lesbians and gays who wanted to see their lives and stories represented. They were inspired by the cut-and-paste DIY approach of another lesbian and gay video project called Framed Youth, Revenge of the Teenage Perverts, which was broadcast late at night in 1987 on Channel 4. Apart from this, and out on a Tuesday, a weekly lesbian and gay magazine program on Channel 4 from 1989, lesbian and gay representation was scarce and rarely originated from within the lesbian and gay community. Alongside the HIV and AIDS epidemic, the video camcorder became available. This new technology allowed for accessibility and new forms of representation. It was easy to use and encouraged the democratization of video production. Prior to this, video recording technology was either low quality or else large and expensive, and quite often both. Access to these new video cameras enabled groups and individuals to create a counter-narrative and alternative to broadcast media. So in 1991, through a carefully written application to Camden Council, which managed to slip through the watchful censorship of Section 28, Pout received funding to purchase their own video camera, and they started shooting and compiling a mixture of video art performances, magazine features, and outrage actions. To give a sense of what they were making, here is a list of contents from the back of Pout Issue 1. Homo Horoscopes, Wish You Were Queer, a travel special. Food Sex, What is Sexy, interviews with people on the streets. Is More Than a Mouthful of Waste? Do Lesbians Cottage? Sexy Stories. Stars in Their Eyes. Cooking with Confidence. Lesbo Fantasies. Classified Lonely Hearts. These features were intercut with footage of outrage demonstrations and actions. Mark explained in a recent interview that by showing this footage between more light-hearted or sexy clips, politics and the work of outrage would be seen as something that could be fun and accessible. So I met up with Mark in 2019 when I was trying to trace the history of AIDS activist video in the UK. And when I started researching this area of activist video, I envisaged footage of mass protests and kissings by lesbian and gay groups in public spaces. The action I had in mind was comprised of handheld, shaky lo-fi camera work, recorded from the perspective of the activists, the grainy colour image pulled and pushed around with the camera person. As I envisaged it, this would be cut together with interviews with small groups of people in domestic spaces, meeting halls and on street corners, reflecting on their personal experiences with doctors, the police, family members, lovers, colleagues, and so on. All of which is very similar to the form of the videos being made previously by community and activist groups in the 70s and 80s. However, after some preliminary research and archives, through discussions with peers researching AIDS activism and correspondence with activists who were there at the time, it became clear that the footage I was recalling, in fact, largely originated in the US. A gap appeared and a question arose. Were these kinds of videos even made in the UK? And if so, where are they now? In 1987, the distribution catalogue for London-based community video group, Albany Video, listed 11 videos available for hire under the heading Health AIDS. 7 were from the UK and 5 from the USA. And when I found this catalogue entry, the majority of the videos that originated in the UK were thought to be lost or no longer in circulation. In New York, the Public Library holds the largest collection of AIDS activist videos in the world with over 600 tapes. This archival project was initiated by AIDS activist and filmmaker Jim Hubbard in the late 1990s, for which he collected over 2,000 hours of completed works and video footage. Conversely, the closest to our equivalent in the UK, the Mediatek at the BFI in London, has 47 videos in its curated selection on HIV and AIDS. Most of these originated on television, and only 12 of these are independent productions. 7 are public health videos, so only the remaining 5 could be classified as alternative productions, that is, those made by artists and activists from within the community of those impacted by HIV and AIDS. In a recent correspondence with the UK-based writer and Outrage co-founder Simon Watney, he explained how the whole profile of AIDS activism in the USA and the UK was radically different. I think that's important to understand, that there was a reason why this work looked different and was being made differently, because the context was so different, because the scale and approach to the epidemic was so different in both countries. American activism was largely responding to a situation resulting from the absence of socialized medicine and focused on treatment issues, whereas he explained the activism in the UK focused on prevention activism and providing a corrective to media representations of people with AIDS. The negative depiction and life-threatening treatment of people with AIDS by mainstream media meant that the need to create alternative images of and by them, by artists and activists from within the community, was as much about developing modes of self-representation as it was about education and activism. Motivated to provide these alternative images, activists, educators, and campaigners understood the need to represent the experiences of those affected, so they were not understood only through their illness, but to represent them as whole people. As the theorist Alexandra Juhas puts it, as people living with AIDS, not dying of AIDS. Jim Hubbard, reflecting on the archival material he helped collect, explains how the tapes portrayed the people involved as neither victims nor pariahs, but as empowered activists taking charge of their health in both the political and medical arenas. He goes on to describe how, although this was not the whole story, it served as a necessary counterpoint to the relentlessly negative depictions by mainstream media. American activist and writer Douglas Crimp wrote about the specific role of video for AIDS activism in his essay, AIDS, Cultural Analysis, Cultural Activism. And just to quote him, "To date, a majority of cultural producers working in the struggle against AIDS have used the video medium. There are a number of explanations for this. Much of the dominant discourse on AIDS has been conveyed through television, and this discourse has generated a critical counter-practice in the same medium." And this is the work that I was really looking for and kind of assumed already existed. Philip Timmins, who produced the community theatre projects with Gay Men Sweatshop in the UK, went on to produce a series of video projects in the 1980s. These included Framed Youth, which I already mentioned, which actually began its life in 1984 as a youth project, and later compromised immunity in 1987, which tells the story of Peter Dennett, a heterosexual hospital nurse, and Jerry Grimmond, who is gay, has AIDS, and has lost his job, home, and lover. Timmins explained in a recent interview his move from theatre to video and the urgency to make a lasting record of the experiences of people whose lives were being treated as ephemeral. He described how he wanted to redress the balance of representation by looking at the emotional lives of different people coming into contact with AIDS. And this is one of the videos that I managed to track down from the Albany video catalogue and have it redigitized. And I watched it with Philip a couple of years ago. Mainstream television in the UK continued to represent, oh, have I missed it? Sorry. On both sides of the Atlantic, the urge to produce and distribute videos that represent the myriad experiences of people with AIDS was motivated by both underrepresentation and misrepresentation in mainstream media. These AIDS activist video projects are indebted to a history of cultural production that understood the necessity of self-expression, the politics of self-definition, and the power of speaking in your own voice. Mainstream television in the UK continued to represent the experience of people with AIDS as one of 3 characters described by Hubbard as the white gay man wasting away from AIDS, the innocent victim, and the drug abuser of colour. This included programmes with the following titles: AIDS, the Victims, and AIDS, the Last Chance, Part 1 and Part 2, both produced by Thames Television. Horizon on the BBC broadcast Killer in the Village in 1983. It charts various developments with AIDS-related research and in the USA, and asks whether the seeds of a spreading epidemic had already reached London. It's a series of speculations about the sources and possible cures for AIDS, explained by a number of experts, rarely giving screen time to people with AIDS. At one point, a patient is shown in a hospital bed speaking to an interviewer, but instead of hearing his voice, we hear his doctor as a voiceover, listing the various infections and illnesses the patient has. Artist, educator, and activist Stuart Marshall stated, "As far as I'm concerned, the way that AIDS has been represented by the media is nothing more than a sophisticated form of queer bashing." As a response to the majority of AIDS-related programming on broadcast television and the widespread demonization of homosexuality, by the mid-1980s, there was a move by video makers, including Sunil Gupta and the Terence Higgins Trust, towards the production of erotic, safer sex videos made to affirm the values of gay liberation. This work sought to re-sexualize gay men by redefining sexual acts and sexual pleasure. Other groups use video to document demonstrations and direct action protests, or to provide a corrective to mainstream media representations of AIDS. The production of AIDS activist video by artists is indicative of the blurred line between the work of artists and activist groups at the time. As Tom Folland has noted in his writing on AIDS activist video in Canada, the seemingly opposed agencies of video art and video activism appear to be united when it comes to one political issue, putting an end to the AIDS crisis. While continually less money is being allotted for the research and development of hundreds of promising drugs, gay and AIDS communities have been utilizing video to counsel and promote safer sex, educate, empower, and mobilize people. To give a sense of what this looked like in the UK, the artist Stuart Marshall made Kaposi's Sarkar in 1983, notably the first AIDS activist video, followed it up in 1984 with both Bright Eyes, a documentary for Channel 4 that examines the social and historical context of AIDS, and the video installation, A Journal of the Plague Year. In 1987, British filmmaker Pratibha Parmar made Reframing AIDS. It is comprised of cultural critics, activists, and media commentators, moving the discussion of AIDS away from the conservative and bigoted positions and instead places the focus on experiences, feelings, and activities of lesbians and gays speaking openly about how they have been affected and how they're challenging dominant perceptions. In the same year, the artist Isaac Julian made This Is Not an AIDS advertisement, excerpts of which feature in Parmar's video, which shows the crossover between what could be considered artist and activist video. It consists of video manipulated Super 8 sequences of the Grand Canal in Venice, Julian with his lover, and images of the work's title flashing in neon light, all set to a soundtrack that repeats the lyrics, "Feel no guilt in your desire, feel no guilt in your desire." In 1990, Anna Thu made the AIDS film poem, Eros of Erosion, and a year later, Christopher Newby made Relax in 1991. Jarman completed his film, Edward II, also 91, a queer and angry restaging of Marlowe's play of the same name, which included members of Outrage holding placards and acting as Edward's supporters against Mortimer, who in turn is backed by actors dressed in police riot gear. These are scenes which wouldn't look out of place in the videos Mark Harriott was starting to shoot by Outrage actions at the same time. So by the early 1990s, with increased access to smaller, cheaper, more portable camcorders, filmmaker and Outrage member Mark Harriott, who was attending the same meetings as Jarman, began to use video to document the actions of the group. As one of the only members with access to a video camera, Mark recalls Peter Tatchell, one of Outrage's other founding members, always making sure he was going to be there to video the action. Outrage adopted an activist practice grounded in the exploitation of the media spectacle and graphic publicity. The videos that were being produced can be understood as fighting through video. The bodies in front of and behind the camera became implicated in such a way to remind the viewer both of their strength, but also their vulnerability. Mark recently digitized what he could find of the VHS-C tapes he recorded on the Panasonic camcorder that was purchased with the funding from Camden Council. Looking back through these rushes, I find what I was looking for, what I was hoping for, footage of angry queers taking up space on the streets, outside police stations and courtrooms holding up placards. I see the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence shouting into megaphones. In one clip, I see bodies laying across the streets and stopping traffic like the actions organized by ACT UP in New York. Then I see Jimmy Somerville, who was part of the group who made Framed Youth, Revenge of Teenage Perverts, went on to form Bronski Beat, whose heartfelt synth-pop soundtracked the lives of queers all over the UK. Then next to him, I see Derek Jarman, dressed in dark clothes, the same long coat he described previously. Later, they are seen flanked by policemen. Someone shouts, "Keep your chin up, mate," as they are loaded into the back of a police van. Mark's camera tracks their movements, recording snatches intermittently. The soundtrack is made up of police warnings on loudspeakers, drowned out by the whistles, chants and screams of the protesters. Okay, did that just play all the way through? I'm a bit confused now. Did the video play all the way through?
Sorry, Ed?
Did the video play all the way through? Or did it just stop?
It just stopped, yeah.
Oh, okay, hang on. Can I go? I don't know why that was. Because in my... Oh, no, it's still playing on... It looks like it's still playing on YouTube, though. So I'm confused.
The payment, we're on. Good man.
Remain lit, but do not offer any resistance.
I cross-referenced this clip with Jarman's biography and worked out that this must have been recorded in February 1992 at an outrage demo challenging and exposing state homophobia, with banners demanding equality now and gay law reform. Early that day, Jarman had made a speech at Bow Street before a march to Whitehall. Peter Tatchell warned those who did not want to get arrested to stay off the road. As the police attempted to force protesters onto the pavement, we see Jarman, Somerville and others lay down in the road. Reflecting later in his book, Smiling Slow Motion, Jarman wrote, I think I had rehearsed this moment in my mind ever since I came to London as a student. Here I was, finally arrested for being myself in this disgraceful society. The work of these artists and the videos made by Harriet and members of POUT are indicative of the way in which the multiplicity of approaches to AIDS activist video engendered myriad strategies, created urgent opportunities, and opened up spaces for communities whose experiences and needs both intersected and differed. Stuart Marshall, who made the first AIDS activist video a decade before Jarman and Harriet, reflected on the range of videos being made, and I quote, AIDS offers us the possibility of building alliances that do not yet exist. Our differences are to be welcomed and our similarities are to be built upon. Furthermore, these differences should be raised to the level of representation. Since commencing this research, I have now located 18 AIDS activist videos in the UK made between 1983 and 1993, and hope to make as many of them possible accessible through the London Community Video Archive website. And before I finish, I just want to thank Conor McStravick, Ryan Conrad, Simon Watney, Mark Harriott, Philip Timmins, Simon McCallum, Ted Kerr, John Grayson, and Sunil Gupta for their help and support in carrying out this research. And thanks to Mark for this, and for Jonas for organising the technical side of things as well.
Great. And thank you, Ed, for this presentation. I had no idea that there was so, in a sense, so little AIDS activist production in the UK. That really is shocking to me, because I know Simon Watney's work was kind of foundational for the development of AIDS cultural theory in the States. His book, Pleasing Desire, was one of the first books. Simon Watney, an art historian, who was the founder of Outrage, as we heard, the AIDS activist group in the UK, was a key early thinker about AIDS and AIDS cultural theory. Yeah, so I find that a fascinating research. We have a lot of subjects in the room right now, so I don't necessarily want to try to reduce them to some kind of common theme, but there were some themes that kind of coursed through the talks that really stuck with me. And maybe on the one hand, there's this kind of gardening and also kind of gender divisions in relation to gardening, and sexual divisions. We heard about the Derek Jarman's it's not his father's garden. That's not the model, but it's, I've been tested, I'm negative, 5 times this week. But it's not his father's garden, but it was his mother's. I forgot, I think Bishnu and Bhaskar were talking about that, some reference to his mother, but also in Rehana's work, in Rehana's explanation of your ecstatic self, talking about a kind of gender division in the structure of the film, and this male sexuality of the brother, and then the kind of woman's care in the garden. So I think that there's, if I'm not misrepresenting that, but I think that there's this strand in the room, and then there's another thread I'll just bring in, which is this question I think Bhaskar raised, quoting Derek Jarman, about the vastness of AIDS and the difficulty of art to respond to it. And then I wonder, is it a difficulty in the UK of activism to respond to it? Is that, maybe that's a that's wrong. But maybe you could, Ed.
I don't think it's a difficulty. I think Simon mentions this kind of, there was just a very different context, and I think there was a difficulty in terms of distribution, because we didn't have the cable TV networks that were accessible in the States and in Canada and North America. So I think there was a difficulty in distribution, and then so where representation relied on 4 channels, and 3 of those were representing them with programs like AIDS the Victims and AIDS the Last Chance and Killer in the Village. It really was down to Channel 4 to do a lot of that work in terms of distribution, and a lot of those things were shown at very late at night and not to mass audiences, so still very limited representation. Mm-hmm. So I think these informal networks, which I've been doing more research into, are really interesting. It was really beautiful. I think when Rehana's brother mentioned the fridge, I think there were Stuart Marshall was organising screenings of AIDS activist videos in gay clubs at that time to sort of shift the narrative and to really take the way the community video works is to take these videos into context where the people are already. So showing AIDS artist video and AIDS activist videos in nightclubs was something he was doing with these informal distribution networks. And similarly from stuff from the States, like Simon talked about having suitcases of tapes, bringing them over from Canada and the States and showing them at the ICA in London. So there was definitely this kind of informal distribution networks, but there wasn't that same access to distribution that there was in the States, I suppose.
I see. Yeah, and maybe we could jump back to this gardening subject in this question of gender divisions. That was something that interested me. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that. I don't know if Bhaskar, if you would want to discuss that, or Bishnu, if you had some connection to that, bringing up, because I thought that was a very interesting idea of the kind of linking the kind of patriarchal tradition of the garden, and then a kind of queer, feminist, if you will, challenging of that, either in the wild garden, the figure of the wildness, or the wild garden. That could be one approach to it. Does that resonate at all?
Yeah, I mean, sorry, go ahead, Bhaskar.
No, you go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many connections between, the ways in which we've approached this garden conceptually. I was actually thinking of in modern nature, there are a few references to how his father wanted these ordered gardens, and he took the axe and cut the apple tree, and his mother would sit under the apple tree, and she sort of protested this assault on nature. Now, it's a very brief references, but we've learned those traces are really important. So I was thinking of that as being able to grow a wild garden as a form of being entangled. And so much of socialities has been that, right? The kind of the material engagement with other bodies, with spaces, with, that's a part of the kind of this animate, queer animacy. So I was trying to get at that through the garden. What was very interesting to me in thinking about Rehana's ecstatic self was, you have these close-up of hands often. So I was seeing the plant as a kind of a mediator, between me, the body, and the natural world. And in your film, the hands, this very tight shots of these hands as gestures that bring and make and extend the self into the world, and this goes back to the gardening as well. In the garden, when we're watching gardening, it's often a focus on the hands, and you see the people, but not so much. So I was, thinking about how we've all been thinking about mediation itself. What is it? What are the mediators? And, Ed's talk with the video camera, of course, like before the body camera, you had the video camera as a body, and it mediated the world. So I think there was something about in Jarman that he's very interested in these points of mediation. What helps us cross between this world, ourselves and the social, ourselves and the natural. So I don't know if that says anything, but I think gardening has something to do with that.
Yeah. No, Rehana that I think Bishnu's elaboration of the hands as mediation to me helps me think further about ways in which, let's say, both in Jarman, he brings together, let's say, this queer performance and gardening, and Bhaskar discussed it as self-indulgence and self-care. But with your film, we have this intimate revelation that your brother is making about his own relationship to religion, religiosity, and sexuality, but you situate that in relation to gardening and care work of women.
Yeah, I mean, I guess when I mentioned this, like the sort of gender spectrum, I wasn't trying to assign positions at all. I guess I was trying to think about how, I think it's also really critical to mention how it's racialized as well, because seeing Asian women in a space that is of pleasure and cultivation, not as labor, not as a plantation, like it's something between that. And so there is something liberatory in this act of cultivation and care and how time is being spent. That is being queered, actually, that is precisely not about the performance and kind of conforming to a role. It begins with that. And I think for me, there's always like it's kind of like a tongue-in-cheek joke that we're in a car with a guy talking about his sexuality, you know, that's the starting point from which things I have unravel. But I was thinking about when you were, this thing around the hands and wanting to bring in, I mean, this has also become a way that I really enjoy filming. So it appears quite a lot in a lot of my films, this fragmented gestural point of focus that in this film I really feel is about tactility as well, and how the body is, how you're reading and being in the film through the body. You know, that kind of close attention to the body, the movement of the hands, and that becomes the rhythm through which we move through these different spaces, whether it's the car traversing wherever it's going, or whether it's the hands handling the plants, which are kind of rose hips. I meant to say, Mark, the red things, okay. Rose, or the chamomile or the hyssop, and the bay that is then burnt as a way of transporting you to another place, like laurel. Mm-hmm. So there's something around the ecstatic that I was really struck by in Jarman's work, where this like heightened kind of these moments, and particularly in that film, where you get like this kind of collapsing of the visual into different layers, but you also get this kind of pulling together of this kind of heavy religious iconography with the turmoil of the body, and everything just feels like it's really amped up to this level that it completely, you know, this like ecstatic kind of shattering. I kind of, I'm really curious about how it comes back to the body, or how this kind of hyper reality is given center stage in that. I think there's something quite profound in his work around that I don't really see in that many other filmmakers of that time. Yeah, I hadn't actually thought about that at the beginning. I mean, but the title "Your Ecstatic Self," and then I think of what Bhaskar presented is very, in a certain sense, is very related. You talked, I think, about, well, it's about excess and the excessive self, the indulgent self. I don't know. It's just maybe now maybe I'm doing this work of trying to connect these things that don't necessarily need to be so directly connected, but I think trying to think about of the ecstatic in Jarman, which is this kind of motion. We heard from Bishnu about the mobility of the necessity of mobility for viruses to circulate, but we also have the kind of ecstatic presentation of the self through these performances in the garden. And
so if I may jump in here, I think Rehana made me think of something that I never had a chance to talk about. You know, it's the gestural capacities of cinema that Jarman is so incredibly interested in pushing and kind of almost exploding, right? And so we have the time-lapse photography, we have the flares, we have the overexposure, we have the color adjustment, we have the kind of all kinds of editing gimmicks. And, you know, like at one point in Modern Nature, he very proudly talks about this film he made that was used as a backdrop for a Pet Shop Boys concert. And he talks about how what you see, you have never seen in cinema before. Now, this is like 89. So, you know, it was pretty early in the digital stuff, right? So I can see why he would say that, and it's remarkable. But I mean, he's really interested in what I might call, you know, like a lot of people talk of this as the representational versus the non-representational. And I find that a little kludzy always, that distinction. But it's still helpful, but I think the two come together in mediation for me. So for instance, Rehana, when you put your brother in the car, it could well be that it's just a matter of convenience. So that's a good place to like talk about all this without having anybody else around. But what it does is it immediately mediates the entire conversation, as you yourself said, right? Put the guy in a car, talking about sex. But it's also about translation, because I mean, I'm just thinking like basic physics, right? A body moves changes position, that's a kind of translation too. And it goes into the kind of translation that we often talk about in cultural studies as, doing some kind of framing or interpreting, right? And you're doing that already by putting him in the car, in a way. But going back to Jarman, I think for me, what's phenomenal about all of Jarman, I will say, is precisely these gestural moves that he makes. It's a kind of gestural cinema that absolutely refuses the stability of the subject. And here, I think, going back, Mark, to what you're saying about the vastness of HIV, one could even say that HIV/AIDS is a complex, like many other complexes. It's a social complex. Bishnu talked about it as being an ecology, right? It's something like that. And the film, for me, does not really work at many levels because it's too over the top, too excessive. It tries to bring in too many things, and it just becomes campy and weird and falls apart. And he talks about that. He himself says it doesn't really work. It failed as art, blah, blah, blah. But at the same time, it's precisely the failure that becomes absolutely so engrossing. I mean, I keep watching it, having not seen it for a while. I still prefer, Last of England or Angelic Conversation or many of those other films. But it's a remarkable film because this is where he addresses in a very direct way his own looming mortality. And so the failure has to do with that too, But I also wanted to say, Ed, I'm so glad you brought up this activism part because I was thinking as I was talking that, God, I'm really making him sound like someone who's retreated, in the garden. This is obviously not true. Yeah.
I mean, that's kind of what I also felt. I often found Jarman indulgent before I read his books. And I think his films are that exploration of what could be called excess or indulgence. But when I was doing this co-editing the sketchbooks and doing research into him, it was his anger that I was really excited about, and how out he was, and how he talked about his illness in a way that wasn't full of fear or full of shame. He was so proud. He was proud until he didn't had no regrets, and the way he talked about sex and sexuality. And I think I was always a bit unsure of his sort of class position and the fact that he was friends with Tilda Swinton and had this kind of very upper class background and how that kind of gave him a lot of privilege and access. But then after his diagnosis, the rate of production for him increased dramatically, and the work he was making became really exciting, I thought. And the paintings he made, I don't know, there was something about that anger that from reading At Your Own Risk that really sort of got me excited about what his queerness gave him access to. And I think that kind of pride and anger felt really exciting to me. And I really wanted, because the book was commissioned by Thames and Hudson, and their best-selling book was The Garden, which mainly was sold to people who were interested in gardening, and that was, and they were kind of cashing in on the success of that book in some way. And I think I didn't want this book to just be a pretty book about a garden. I actually really like The Garden. It's a great book, but I wanted it to be more about the other parts of his life. And so I got really excited about that side of things. And the fact that he involved the outraged people, members in Edward II, just seemed like a really beautiful bit of symmetry about that kind of journey between art and activism and his own politics and his own storytelling. And how you could take something like Edward II, which maybe was quite inaccessible and quite lofty, and then make it something really sexy and political and appealing and contemporary, was where I felt, because he studied classics, right, on the condition that then, with his dad saying that then he could go to art school if he studied something like classics. So how he brought these different worlds together was actually where I got really excited about him as well.
So I have to mention, some of you may have seen this already. Tom Kalin, I was talking to him recently, and he reminded me of his film called Confirmed Bachelor from 1994, which is, again, a garden film, except on the soundtrack, what you hear is from this notorious Christian fundamentalist video called The Gay Agenda, where they graphically describe what the gays do, like, how incredibly nasty and piggy they are and all the kind of grotesque sexual activities. And so he kind of like plays that on the soundtrack and shows us these gorgeous, resplendent gardens, often hothouse flowers. He was telling me how that was completely inspired by Derek Jarman's garden.
Ah, interesting. That would be a wonderful extension of the program to show that film. Yeah, Tom Kalin, the American director, independent director, who's maybe most known in queer cinema context for his film Swoon from '92, I believe, the best American independent.
Savage Grace.
And then Savage Grace, of course. Yeah, a little bit later.
2007.
Great. Yeah, maybe it would be good to see if there's any questions or comments from those of you who've stayed with us this evening. Yeah, if you have any comments about any aspects of the discussions, we'd be happy to hear from you. And I think Maryland has a microphone just so that our guests can hear you at home. Are there any comments or questions?
It's got dark here whilst we've been talking. You found that, Rehana, as well?
Pardon me?
It's got dark here whilst we've been talking, so the lighting's really changed.
Yeah, I see in Rehana's room it's gotten dark. It's gotten dark here too. Well, we're like under the ground, so we don't know. There could be an apocalypse up above and we'd all be safe and live in the world of the garden. Yeah, here's one comment.
Hi. I can ask one question. The film Your Ecstatic Self, there was the third images from hunso.com. Could you say something about it? I would like to know.
Did you hear that, Rehana?
Yeah, it was a question about the hunso.com footage. And
yes.
Yeah. Thank you for the question. I couldn't see you, but I heard you. Yeah, the material is from, it's kind of just archive material that I found through a rabbit hole on the internet. But it specifically relates to sort of pre-Islamic rituals in Pakistan, in an area that's it's sort of not exactly where my family are from, but kind of close to, but is a kind of ethnically contentious area, which has a lot of minority communities coexisting together in that particular place, and it has this tradition of shamanic practice, ecstatic practice, where specifically through land rituals with the land. So within like agricultural communities, a shaman called a baitan is identified who will perform this ritual as a way of communing with spirits and entering into a kind of a process with an oracle in order to forecast and how the community should resolve conflict or how the community might farm. And I guess I was interested in this particular ritual that's now become a tourist attraction that is kind of detached from its original mystical and religious potential, as a kind of a way of speaking to both this feeling of wanting to enter into this other cosmology that's kind of proximate, that kind of reasserts how we might engage and think about knowledge making and orientating ourselves in relation to the world and landscape and the purpose of how we work with land. That isn't about extraction and exploitation and agriculture in the bigger sense that it's become through land capital, but it's also, I guess there's I lost my train of thought a little bit there, but yeah, that's kind of what drew me to it. But also this kind of way of trying to speak to how within a Western tradition, these areas have become kind of, Tantra, has these like associations with it that have become very much perceived through a Western lens. And even in Sajid's conversation and the way that he speaks, there is this kind of shifting between a resistance to, but also a kind of internalizing, actually, of a like a colonial discourse, really. So I think this particular footage seemed to resonate as a way of accessing these different conversations and placing it and bringing it into the film. And I find it utterly compelling as well as a kind of musical register, again, this physicality of what this dance is and how it appears. So yeah, so it was a way of, again, sitting with this idea of the ecstatic. And it felt kind of, yeah, available. It exists in the public domain freely. So it's kind of, it's an odd thing. I hope that answers. I don't want to go on too much.
Yes. Yeah, you just got a thumbs up.
Okay.
Good. Are there other comments or questions? It's a little difficult with the shining light for me to see everyone. Oh, yes. There is another question. Yes.
Yeah, question for Ed. I never really realized that Stuart Marshall and Derek Jarman, of course, were contemporaries and working in proximity. So did they actually meet? Was there a relation between them? Do you know about this?
And maybe you could say just a little bit more about Stuart Marshall, just for people who may not know of him.
Sure, that's a great question. Yeah, I think that's why I made this weird map thing to try to like show the kind of context that we're talking about in a way, and to try to like kind of represent it. But I don't know if they met. I mean, they would have been aware of each other's work for sure. I have, and Connell McTravick, who I thank in my thank yous, he's the Stuart Marshall go-to for me, so he would know more probably. I don't think I've come across any references to Marshall in Jarman's research. I mean, yeah, I guess they're working at the same time. Was that and did they? Oh yes, so Stuart Marshall made this video Kaposi's Sarkar in '83, which is super early for AIDS activist video. And it was only when I read in Alexandra Duhas's book AIDS TV, which was an American title, which also states that as one of the first one that she had heard of, which made me think this is crazy that there's so little known about AIDS activist video in the UK. There's a lot more known about AIDS artist video in the UK, but not this activist work. And this, I guess, the work of Stuart Marshall sits really between artist and activist work. And it doesn't exist anymore. No one can find it. And so I only managed to find a clip of it through Connell, who found an interview with Stuart Marshall talking on this amazing Canadian cable TV show called Gable Vision, where he was in Canada for a film festival and they were showing Kaposi's Sarkar at that, and there's a clip of it as part of his interview. But that's the only bit. I've only seen a bit of it, and it looks like a lot of rostrum footage of newspaper headlines with him talking over the top of it, which is kind of reminiscent of what he ended up making in more documentary forms. But I think that that work really like set a precedent for like this idea of interrogating media representations of HIV and AIDS at the time, and how to like use the form of video to kind of I guess challenge some of those modes of representation. But yeah, I guess it's just important to think that they were working at the same time. There was this group called the Lesbian and Gay Media Group that were formed in about '84, who managed to get a slot on BBC Community Programmes Unit. So there was one BBC programme made by lesbian and gays about AIDS, which was also kind of interrogating particularly the media misrepresentation of HIV and AIDS at the time. And Stuart Marshall was on that committee as well. I don't know if Jarman was also involved. I don't think he was. I guess Marshall was probably at the outrage meeting, but I wouldn't want to say that they didn't need it, but it's a good question. They were definitely in the same crossing over, but mainly in kind of the outrage scene. And it also speaks to that kind of thing that Tom Folland says about this kind of collapsing between artist and activist work at the time.
And was Jarman an AIDS activist?
I think after his diagnosis, he got really involved, and he did a lot of. If you read the biography by Tony Peake, he talks kind of a bit about how outrage might have like made as much as they could out of Jarman's fame at the time to sort of draw attention to the cause. And Jarman was, I think, pretty happy to do that. Like, there's amazing stickers that like they stuck all over cars, and like Jarman writes a lot about how important his work with activism was. So yeah, I'd say he became. That's what I think was interesting. Like once he had AIDS, like I think his relationship to activism really changed. It was that kind of experience.
I had a quick question, if that's okay.
Yeah, please.
Unless there's someone in the audience, because I've spoken loads, but it was to the other panelists, really.
Yeah, no, I think we'd love to hear it.
I think it's I'm just picking up on something you actually said to me, Mark, so I'm slightly stealing you and your mind, but I just had this question really of what I've been trying to work out is, particularly in regards to sort of contemporary activism around HIV and AIDS, and thinking a bit about, so the charity that I was working with was largely working with young people of African descent, and thinking a bit about some of the concerns and issues that would come up within those spaces. And this is more from my volunteering there than that came up in the workshops, but a lot to do with trafficking, or a lot to do with, safeguard. It works specifically with young people. And I kind of was wondering, in terms of both like as a historical thing, looking back, how sort of intersectional, to use a term in a weird direction, was Jarman's activism. And I can't get a sense, also thinking about the kind of conversations we're having around race and gender and these different meeting points of different dynamics, like where Jarman sort of sat within that. It looked like you were saying about class when I've only read Dancing Ledge, but I kind of am really confronted with this narrative of someone who is quite middle class and quite white, moved through quite white circles. And so I'm trying to think now about also how would he connect with an audience that is maybe dealing with AIDS activism from a much more intersectional position, or thinking about these questions of virus and disease and the body and disability justice and class, the multiple ways in which we can read this. And I just wondered if anybody here had if that kind of presumption that I'm making around his sort of very white, safe middle class, not safe obviously, but moving through the world from that position is correct. And like how do we deal with the legacy of his work then, when we're kind of trying to interrogate and dismantle those things?
No, I think it's a totally relevant question. It's one of the things I wondered about, also about the kind of institutionalization and canonization of Jarman, not back then by the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence, but now in terms of this, the Jarman Award, and also the campaign around to save Prospect Cottage that Jarman, from the outside, I'm not in England, but Jarman seems to have attained a kind of canonical status, and is that reaffirming a sort of white middle class male position? Maybe for Ed also, I'm thinking like how to. It's something I think about looking back to like ACT UP New York and trying to think through that work from an intersectional perspective. How would you address Rehana's concern, even looking back to AIDS activism in England?
I would say it was a concern I had too, in a way, like definitely around class and the whiteness of his world. It was just like I was really struck by the whiteness of his world looking back to the archive, and just an absence really, like of casting, of the way that he thought about the world he was making, the fact that he could have been like he could have cast differently and didn't. And I think when Tilda Swinton's father was one of like the most decorated military people like ever. Like they weren't just middle class, they were upper class, and I think Jarman was too. And he could only afford, he bought Prospect Cottage after his father died and left him inheritance, and he paid cash for it. Like, he was definitely existing in a different world. And I think that's why after his diagnosis, something did shift in him about his vulnerability and his awareness of, I mean, maybe say like, I don't want to be too heavy-handed with it because I think it's difficult because he can't speak for himself. But like, there was definitely a shift, I think, about how he understood his position in the world once he was made much more vulnerable. And I think that really grounded him in ways that I think made his work accessible and, for me, more interesting. But it still didn't change the makeup of the world that he existed in, I don't think. Although, I mean, definitely, like, I mean, he writes about cruising and the different kinds of bodies he was having sex with, and they're definitely not all white. The way that he writes about race in terms of his sex life is quite varied, I think. But I think it's good to have a level of like the understanding of that background when you watch his work and you understand him. But I think there's been I don't know if I can speak really well to this, but Sarah Schulman has been talking to this recently and with her new book about how how the framing of gay white men now can't be understood as how it was then, because she talks about gay white men that then being chased out of their homes, being victims. There was like about what queer bashing looked like for gay white men at that time, and so she's been trying to understand I mean, she's a very contentious character, but like how she's been trying to talk about the experience of gay white men then and now, and to not try to conflate those experiences, I think, in some way, which I think is like interesting work. And I haven't done enough research into it to feel like back one side or the other, but just to say that, like, I think I was interested to hear her come out so strongly in defense in that way of that position, as one that wasn't a privilege, one of privilege, if you like. And I think that's kind of, it was like another thing to think about when I was sort of framing Jarman's experience at that time. But yeah, I think it's definitely one that I consider a lot when I've been looking at his work and how I sit with it now. I guess that's, I mean, I did a lot of work. I guess I'm really like Pratima Parmar's work and Sunil Gupta's video, Crazy and Scared Stiff, which I've been working on, like getting reconstructed, have, I guess, brought a different voice and perspective to that world, which I think is really important to like remember that there was a lot of other work being made as well. And I guess things with like, I think about community video and ephemerality and AIDS as all linked together, and the way that these bodies were treated and the way the material was treated meant a lot of this work disappeared. And I think trying to like tell a more full picture of that time feels really important as well. Sorry, that was a really garbled answer, but just to say that I think it's complicated, and to think about intersectionality retrospectively is really complicated as well, I think.
I was also very interested in the Schulman, actually, Ed, when you were talking about it, but because I was thinking there is this, Rehana's question, I think, gets to the heart of it, that there is so much privilege, and I don't think we can get around that, you know, the sort of the embodied what the person was. But I was thinking when Ed was presenting that instead of thinking of Jarman's own intersectional politics, whether one of the points that Schulman makes is these gay white men became these nodes. And when we actually questioned, you know, their position of privilege, it brought into view a whole other public sphere of a lot of people who were fighting this, right? There were people with cameras, they had access, they had visibility, yes. But if you question that access and visibility, you actually bring into being, in tension, other people. And I think that's very interesting, because if you take Jarman as a historical node, in the way that I was thinking when Ed was presenting, you have anger as a public sphere, right? I mean, there are a lot of people in that demonstration who are not middle. I mean, I don't know their class, but it just seems like a milieu of a lot of people who are not quite as privileged, perhaps, as Jarman. And to use his presence as a way to bring into circulation all of these other communities and anger as a public sphere, because our deliberative public sphere had failed. There wasn't discussing AIDS in this way. So I think there's something to questioning his lack of intersectionality, perhaps, as a useful, you know, at this.
And maybe that just as a way, perhaps, to slowly bring this to a close. Unless, I mean, I don't mean to cut a discussion short if we want to continue with it, but but we have been going. It's a long evening, but I'm thinking about that perhaps then. I mean, there's I don't know. I feel I was a little uncertain myself about the Save Prospect Cottage campaign and this kind of massive amount of money in these big institutions, and I wonder, like, that seems to be somewhat of a different model than the Derek Jarman as a mode. And if we think of Derek Jarman, if we do have if we want to have a critical lens, to have an intersectional perspective on Jarman and on his world, maybe mapped out similarly to the way Ed was doing it in his presentation, then we would want to fight against a certain kind of reification of this great white man.
For sure. Can I just say a thing on that briefly? Yeah. Because when I remember having a conversation with Keith when he was still alive and looking after the Prospect College, and he said, like, he would only, because he said he would only give, because of English Heritage wanted to buy it at one point, and he said he would only give it to them if they promised to ban fox hunting on all of their properties. And that idea of using it politically was really exciting to me. But then when I saw all that stuff come up, I was like, Jarman would want it to wash into the sea and disappear. I don't think this idea of keeping it forever is in his nature. And I think that would have been the ultimate, is to let it just wash away. And I say that as someone who loves going there, but if you go there now, it's just it's crazy. Like, it's like a tourist attraction. It doesn't feel, I mean, I don't know. I feel like, just to say that I'm with you on this. It should wash away.
but I guess then watching, in a sense, has it become the patriarchal garden? Has it become his father's garden? And therefore we have to wash it away. Or at least that would be our work, maybe in continuing, if we want to get to continue to mine something out of Jarman's work in life. Perhaps we can do it against some aspects of his work in life, and that could that could be one productive approach. But I think we should probably call it an evening. It's been really wonderful. Just it feels so intimate to have you here at this bar. And it's kind of this magic of mediation that has allowed this to happen. And of course, sometimes it kind of breaks down, but then you stuck with us, and you all stuck with us here. So I thank you. But I'm so appreciative that you've all been here. Rehana, Zaman, Bhaskar, Sarkar, Bishnupriya, Ghosh, and Ed Web-Ingall. Thank you so much for discussing today.
Thank you so much as well, Mark. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank everyone here. And I'll just tell you and tell all our listeners at home that the final presentation will be next Wednesday, the 18th, and that's when we'll deal more explicitly with radiation. And in a sense, we're forgetting Derek Jarman by returning to a period before the garden, namely to the early 80s and the period of feminist anti-nuclear activism. Club des Femmes will be here, So Meyer and Selena Robertson, who will present the film Carrie Greenham Home, by Amanda Richardson and Bibong Kidron from 1983, I believe. And they will give a fantastic presentation, contextualization of that film and its importance for the development of feminist activism, anti-nuclear activism, and also for feminist experimental cinema that emerged around this work. So that would conclude Nature is Not Natural. And I could just say again, thank you all for being here. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you for holding out.